really, what I'm keen to talk about is the threat posed to democracy and basic liberties by oligarchs, kleptocrats, billionaires more generally, people, I suppose, like Mr. Firtash, but not just from countries that we think of as being corrupt, like Ukraine, but also countries that are corrupteurs, whether that's the UK or the US or many other Western countries that score very highly on the Transparency International Index, but perhaps shouldn't do so. So, Peter, I'm going to ask you to set the scene. You regularly investigate efforts to infiltrate money into our democracy more broadly. So, could you set the scene a little bit about what is at stake and what currently tricks people are using in order to slip money through the threadbare defences that we've set up?
Thank you very much, Oliver, and thanks to Zeg Festival for having us here. It's really, it's lovely to be here, and it feels very fitting to be talking about some of this in this wonderful kind of faded grandeur of Finsbury Town Hall, which can feel a little bit like, I think for all of us, British democracy can feel a little bit like a faded grandeur too, so thank you very much for this. And so I run a thing called Democracy for Sale, and what we're all about really is money, power, and politics. And a huge amount of that is, as you say, is looking at like how influence happens in British politics and how easy it is to influence the British political system. So effectively, we should have really good guardrails in Britain to stop people influencing our politics. So we've got laws which are about 25 years old, which ban foreign donations into political parties. Compared to the United States, there isn't as much money in British politics, so in some ways you might feel that means that our politics should be actually less susceptible to money. But the reality is actually, we have a system that runs on private funding. You can give unlimited amounts of money, unlike the United States actually. The United States there actually is caps on donations, but you can use super PACs to circumvent them. But in Britain, you can give unlimited amounts of money. And what effectively has happened is, and you've narrated this in a lot of your work too, Oliver, is that a very small class of people, a very small group of very wealthy people, overwhelmingly are the people who fund our politics. So there's really useful research done by Transparency International that found that in 2023, 2/3 of the private money in British politics came from just 19 people. So 19 millionaires gave 2/3 of the money in British politics. Often they are people that fit into some of the patterns that you've described there in your presentation. The Conservative Party have taken a lot of money from people who hold British passports who made money in Russia. A lot of them are people who were born in Russia. We've seen that time and again. We've seen many times people who've made money in other jurisdictions who've been linked with corruption have become major political donors. We have a system in which very few questions are asked about political donations. I interviewed Jane Bradley from the New York Times this week in Democracy for Sale, and she was talking about a story she worked on about Ehud Sheleg, who was the chairman of the Conservative Party. She had traced funding from a sanctioned Russian bank into a bank account that was then transferred to the Conservative Party. All of which looks incredibly suspicious, that should be investigated. That was never investigated. There was nothing done, and that time and again is the nature of what you see in British politics. So that's all bad. So basically, that's a problem. The fact that very rich people, often very rich people who've made money in questionable ways, can bankroll our politics. But I think what we're seeing now more and more, that I think is even more concerning, is actually the ways in which you can bankroll politics without giving money to politicians or to political parties. So we have laws in this country where you have to disclose who gives money to parties, and actually they're broadly followed. So parties do disclose where they get money from because, frankly, it's not in their interest not to. So we can see when somebody X, it's actually interesting. So many of the people that you named in your presentation there, what they were doing effectively, like Firtash with Cambridge, is reputation laundering. They're laundering their reputation by giving money to things like Cambridge University. Giving money to political parties is also a way to launder your reputation. So that's part of the reason you do it. But what if you're trying to influence the political process in Britain? What if you're really actually genuinely trying to influence the political process, not just launder your own reputation? There's lots of ways you can do that in ways that we cannot see. So you can give money to a think tank, which can lobby government, which can influence politics, all of which can do it in very opaque ways. You can give money to things called unincorporated associations, which can then give money to political parties. Again, it's a mask where you can't see where this money has come from. But what I think we're seeing more and more is super rich people, billionaires, can influence our politics in other ways that are, I think, becoming even more pernicious and more powerful. I think one of the strongest ways we're seeing is actually media. So if you look, say, not just in Britain, if you look at, say, Elon Musk and Donald Trump. Elon Musk gave about $300 million to Donald Trump, the Republican Party, in 2024. He also put X behind Donald Trump's re-election campaign. I think it's pretty clear what was more effective. The money or X. I think X was far more effective. We're starting to see that happening already in Britain too. So I wrote a big piece earlier this year for the London Review of Books about a man called Paul Marshall. Paul Marshall used to be a Lib Dem donor, then he became a Brexit supporter, he became a Conservative donor. So he got a history of donation to politics. He doesn't donate to politics anymore. But what he does do is he has spent over £100 million already bankrolling GB News, covering the losses of GB News. He recently bought The Spectator. He owns Unheard. He has lots of other interests that are what you might call parapolitical. In many ways, these are far more effective at turning and changing the political conversation in a way that is in his interests than giving money to a political party. And I think that's the thing I'm starting to see more and more in my work. Like, Britain is very susceptible to money. British politics is very susceptible to money. British parties, time and again, will almost do whatever you want in exchange for surprisingly small amounts of money. But not just that, more and more, the way our political system is run, the way is that it can be influenced in ways that I think are increasingly opaque, but actually are kind of parapolitical.
Thanks. So, Sue, we often talk about what's at stake in terms of the infiltration of big money into politics. And I often think about this, about, what is the difference between money and power? Why doesn't, for example, in Russia, money equals power, they're the same thing. In Britain, obviously they correlate, there is an overlap, but they're not exactly the same thing. But why is it that you think it matters that we control and limit the influence of money in our political processes, in the exercising of power?
So I'm going to go quite big picture because I've been stuck on a very slow train. But I mean, look, the bottom line is the democracy is on the line, and it's on the line globally. Last year, for the first time in 20 years, there were more autocracies than democracies. And so there are now 91 autocracies and 88 democracies. And it's the lowest level of kind of democratic health for 50 years. We're in trouble. And I think you cannot separate that from the rise of billionaires and extreme inequality, basically. You've got Oxfam talking about 4 new billionaires being made every week in 2024. Back in 2005, there were 691 billionaires. At the moment, there are 3,028. It's a huge, huge rise. And academics have proven the link between both, the rise of extreme inequality and democratic backsliding, and also the rise of corruption. So I think what you're seeing is kind of 2 phenomena as a result. You've got the rise of the autocratic billionaire, so the people you were talking about, and if you look at the 10 billionaire politicians in the world today, this was an analysis done earlier this year, 6 of them are autocrats, so Putin, $70 billion, and the other 2 are American, one of them Donald Trump. But you've also got the rise of the billionaire that kind of Peter's talking about, which the tech bros, and they don't believe in democracy anymore. They simply don't see any need for it or why it benefits anyone, and they think the world should be run by a cognitive elite, i.e. them. I don't know if any of you read Peter Thiel's piece in the Financial Times, but it was absolutely eye-opening about what vision they have for us, the little people. Anyway, the irony is that these billionaires and the kind of populist right movements that they fund are really use corruption as the reason why they need to take power. So you've got this paradox that these people who are actually very, very corrupt themselves are kind of promoting this idea of the corrupt elite that kind of control government, and then taking, pushing that to push, very extreme ideas which would involve the complete dismantling of the checks and balances against corruption and against democracy. So I think we're in a fight for our democratic lives.
So I'd like to hear from someone in the audience. Particularly, I'd like to hear from someone who is from a country, maybe, which is suffering with issues around democracy. Anyone who's got a story to tell, a personal story to tell, anything of that nature? Any hands up? No one wants to speak. Well, I mean, I would include Britain in that. Anyone at all? Go on. No. No one.
It's very healthy then, isn't it?
Yeah, well, basically everyone is satisfied and confident that democracy in the countries that they live is doing very well. That's good. Oh, go on, we've got someone right at the back. Excellent. Do we have a microphone? Yeah, excellent. Hey, wait for a microphone, please.
My personal story is not at all interesting, but I'm from Georgia, and I think the majority knows that what is happening in Georgia at the moment. And I'm very surprised that nobody has mentioned Georgia so far, and I'm really looking forward to the final talk, which is going to be about Georgia. So reversal of democracy is horrendous in Georgia at the moment, and I think social media, what we've been talking about this morning, is playing a huge part. And Russia, obviously, a lot of talk started with Russia and role of Russia in sort of reversal of democracy in ex-Soviet countries. However, Georgia is a very unique situation at the moment because Georgians themselves turned against Georgians and joined very much sort of Russian propaganda regime. And so it's very much sort of betraying the country. So they are really, on the one hand, there is an enemy, clear enemy. Russia is an enemy of Georgia at the moment, but also part of Georgians joining enemy is doubly painful and like sign of massive betrayal. So, yeah, I mean, there's nothing I can do about it. I can say more about it, but I'm very surprised that nothing has mentioned about it, given that this is Georgian event from Georgia.
Well, I'm very glad that you have mentioned it, and I'm very interested by what you say about allying with the enemy. I feel that oligarchs, as it were, are oligarchs without borders, rather like MSF. They have OSF, and they essentially see themselves as having a nationality. I call it Moneyland. Tom Burgess called it kleptopia. I think that oligarchs are very happy to be citizens of their own country, which is different to the place where we live. Now, however, as we often say, talking to each other, there is no point in being pessimistic. If you are a pessimist, even if you win, you lose. So I think radical optimism is required in order to envisage a better future and therefore to move towards it. So Sue, let's have a bit of radical optimism about what we can do to try and, at the very least, contain the oligarchs in their own country and stop them coming into ours.
Well, I'm really glad you raised Georgia, because I think one of the first things I want to say is, one of the first things we've got to do is reclaim the fight against corruption as a fight for democracy. And we've seen incredibly brave people go out onto the streets in a whole range of countries over the last year. So we've seen in Nepal, I don't know if anyone's following in Nepal, like, extraordinary unseating of a corrupt government by students who went out in the street and braved bullets. People died, and they overthrew the government. And you saw it in Bangladesh. You mentioned Bangladesh, but the reason we know about what was going on in Bangladesh, which was all hidden because all the donors and Western countries were like, this is an amazing country, it's a success story. But actually, over $250 billion worth of money was being looted out of it over 10 years by the Hasina regime. And we wouldn't know that if it wasn't for the incredibly brave people who went out into the streets and protested and said enough, and a lot of it was about corruption, and they said enough is enough, and people died. You see it in Serbia at the moment, huge anti-corruption protests, and we've seen people in the streets in Georgia as well. So I think, those are the people that, we need to be here for, as well as the future generations. But I think if we kind of, we've also got to tackle the big issues, like inequality, unfair access of those who have money to politicians, the work that anti-corruption campaigners do in this country with the help of people like you two who expose the problem, and then we go to the government and say, you've got to, have much fairer rules. It's really critical, because basically people feel the rules are essentially rigged against them, and that politicians only listen to the wealthy, and they're not completely wrong. So we need to tackle that and close down those, those political integrity gaps. And then finally, this ending the role of, the UK and financial centres like Dubai as just absolutely major enablers of the great rip-off of countries. And I wanted to end on a positive note, actually, because I know we've got to do radical optimism. But there was a lot of work around international tax transparency, and it actually reaped incredible results. As a result of it, 114 billion euros worth of tax revenue was recovered, whether in tax fines or revenue that public exchequers got. And there was a 25% reduction in the use of offshore banks. So actually, if we join together and get serious and create the political will behind international initiatives, they can actually work.
I think we're going to hear from our very own tech magnate and media baron, Natalia.
Yes, I have used my corrupt powers and grabbed the mic. First of all, I want to address the previous question and say that we, as one of the organizers, we worried this morning that we spent too much time talking about Georgia, and as Oliver pointed out, obviously it's very important to connect these trends and dots, because all of this is connected. So very grateful to you for doing it so eloquently. One question that I have really for all three of you is, through all the amazing work that the three of you are doing, that we should all be very grateful to you for, what is like one single trend that you are seeing that is not yet being picked up by the mainstream narratives? Like, what is it? What is that one thing we should all be paying attention to?
Peter.
Well, that's a good question. I think what as I mentioned earlier, I think what I'm seeing more and more, which I think is really disquieting in many respects, is this extent to which this kind of billionaire class that Sue's narrated so well, and these kind of super rich people that Oliver's narrated so well, are able to kind of effectively use and influence the political process in ways that we just cannot see. So, for example, I recently did a big story about the Tony Blair Institute and Larry Ellison. Larry Ellison is one of the world's richest men. He was briefly the world's richest man actually last month. He's he's an 81-year-old man who's got a face that looks like it hasn't changed since about for about 30 years. And he has got huge global ambitions. He's like Sue describes, he's one of these people who really doesn't believe that democracy is much of a thing at all. He's not something that he's particularly keen on. His son owns Paramount, and he's very much plugged into the Trump world. And what I was looking at was the influence, and my colleagues at Lighthouse as well were working with us on it, Lighthouse Reports, was looking at the influence that Larry Ellison's money, because he's given the Tony Blair Institute more than £250 million, the influence it's had. And it was quite remarkable. It's quite remarkable to see how this big organisation, as an organisation, becomes so big on the back of Ellison's money, and how effectively it operated as a sales arm for Ellison. And why does this matter? It matters because for someone like Larry Ellison, £250 million really is a drop in the ocean. You can then buy access to people who have the ear of powerful people. Like Tony Blair is a big name. He's a big name globally still. How cheap it is actually for billionaires to use the established modes of politics and effectively buy them, effectively take over these carapaces of kind of established political norms, established political parties, established political people, and use them as playthings or use them for whatever they want. Elon Musk had done it with Donald Trump. If Elon Musk was not so absolutely off the wall, he would still be able to do whatever he wanted with Donald Trump. There's actually a big piece in the FT today looking at just how much benefit Trump's backers like Mark Andreessen and the Winklevosses have got out of Trump, way beyond the kind of extent we'd seen before, where there was always a tendency of influence. I've written about it for years, and others, where political donors get advantageous things happening. We've now seen that going supernova. And I think we're missing this, actually. I think we're missing this analysis. We're missing really understanding that this is a step change. This is not how things were before. This is a really, really big change. I think we're misunderstanding how that is able to feast off the kind of almost like I found myself reading at the moment Lapedusa's novel *The Leopard*, which I'd never read before. If you haven't, it's fantastic, and it's about the last days, in some ways, of the days of Garibaldi and the Risorgimento. But what it is how these dying, decaying political systems are so corruptible as well, and buyable and biddable by huge wealth. And I think we are really missing that real analysis of that, and seeing it within those terms. It's about, on one level, financial gain, yes, but I think this is more than just financial gain as we understand it. It's more than the kind of quid pro quo that a Tory donor gets a PPE contract. This is much more about actually being able to take over the entire levers of power and to deliver us into a very different anti-democratic moment. And I think for lots of reasons there's a real reluctance to face that.
Sue, do you have thoughts?
I mean, I think that, you've hit the nail on the head on what you said earlier, Peter, about the whole landscape that they fund that then dictates what people read, what they hear, what they look at. I do also think, there is a real failure of centrist politics. Like, there's only so much that journalists and campaigners can do if you don't have a decent political alternative being offered that is really tackling the issues of the day. And I don't know, what we do about that, but it is clear that, the centrist politicians have their eyes so focused on the right that they appear to be opening the Overton window for the far right ever more and allowing it to get more and more extreme. So that's above our pay grades, but doesn't mean we can't all play our role in trying to tackle it.
Yeah, I mean, we have reached 4:30, which is the end of this period. But I will tell you, because I do think optimism is a revolutionary act at a time of difficulty. And a weird thing that makes me optimistic, because I do spend my time writing about billionaires taking over countries, buying bits of countries, creating sovereign zones. It can be easy to be depressed a lot of the time. But coming to something like this, or just going to somewhere where ordinary people talk to each other and you realize that we're not monsters shouting at each other on social media, we're just decent people drinking coffee and having a natter. So be optimistic and talk to people and exchange phone numbers, go for a drink. I think that at a time when billionaires are trying to atomize us and drive us apart, there is something important and inherently optimistic about coming together. So please do that. All good?